Good morning. This is Valerie Leonard. I'm the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning. As you may or may not be aware, we are focusing this month in the Nonprofit Utopia community on federal grants. We have an 8-part series, and today is the last of 8 workshops or live streams on federal grants. And if you want to catch up on what you've missed, you can always go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. All right, so today we're going to be talking about what you should do once you get a federal proposal funded. All right. So, want to give you a little bit of information about Nonprofit Utopia. We're the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. We have a private, safe space where our members can innovate and talk about things that they've learned on the job and get information from one another. And again, this is all in a safe space and it's private, it's off of Facebook. And our mission is to develop the next generation of ethical nonprofit leaders. And we do this through professional development. So this could be through consulting, it could be through courses, it could be through coaching and podcasts and live streams such as this. So our overall goal is to give our members the tools that they need in order to not only develop their own leadership skills, but to develop their organizations and make sure that their organizations are moving towards sustainability over the long term. And our vision is to strengthen the nonprofit sector by providing training to over 50,000 nonprofit leaders between now and 2033. If you want to learn more about us, you can go to nonprofitutopia.com, or if you're serious about joining us, go to nonprofitutopia.mn.co. A little bit about myself. I have spent more than 25, closer to 30 years in the nonprofit sector. That includes working for a major hospital system, helping to arrange financings in over $100 million for construction. I have also run a nonprofit organization. I teach nonprofit management courses at UIC. I also teach social enterprise courses at Roosevelt University. And as you can see from this list, we have covered quite a bit. We have talked about assessing your organization's capacity to apply for federal grants. We have talked about the federal grant funding life cycle. We showed you how to navigate Grants.gov. We also showed you how to create a workspace on Grants.gov. And we took a break and talked about tax credits as a form of COVID relief. And then a couple days ago, we shared some strategies, some real strategies as to how you can go about strengthening your chances of actually getting federal funds. And today we're going to talk about what you do once you get the federal grant. All right, and it should be noted too that this presentation is intended to provide general guidelines that may or may not apply to your specific situation, because as I indicated before, every agency follows general guidelines, but each agency has discretion as to how they're going to proceed. And even within those agencies, no two grant opportunities are the same. There's constant change. Specific program requirements will vary based on passage of time, the specific program or agency, and you need to consult with the respective program administrator for specific guidance as to how to manage your particular program. All right, so the goals and objectives for today are: 1, to increase nonprofit organizations' capacity to manage federal grants. We want to demystify the federal grants management process. We want to provide an overview of the entire grant cycle from application to closeout. And then we want to provide an opportunity for you to assess your risks core competencies, and the challenges of managing federal grants. And it's good to know all of this stuff before you even start applying. All right, so as you can see, we have a whole lot to cover. We're going to talk about how you can better understand the reporting and oversight process. We'll share some definitions of terms. We'll talk about the budget cycle. We'll talk about core competencies for effective grants management, and that includes managing risk, understanding federal requirements, program implementation, and how you can translate the proposal from a proposal to actually putting a plan in place and using it. And we'll also talk about managing and administering subgrants. We'll talk about financial management, using management systems, record keeping, showing you ways to document your progress, showing you how to address weaknesses, talk about common compliance issues, and then show you how you can take corrective action. All right, again, this is Valerie Leonard. I'm the founder of Nonprofit Utopia, sharing with you ways that you can manage your grant once you get it from the federal government. And the good thing is these principles apply not only to federal grants, but generally speaking, this is the way you want to approach most grants that you get. I will say that the federal government, is more complex and they have much more paperwork. But if you can get yourself to the point where you know what to expect from the federal government, I guarantee you managing funds from anyone else will be so much easier. All right. So, just to give you some background material, in 2006, the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act was passed, and it put in motion a government-wide reporting procedure that has continued to evolve. And folks here in the state of Illinois should know that our own system at the state level, the GATA system, was modeled after the federal system. In fact, Illinois was the first state in the union to actually develop a state system very similar to Grants.gov. And we'll talk more about that next month. All right, so at the federal level, the law requires that information about entities and organizations receiving federal funds be disclosed to the public via a central website. And you could go to usaspending.gov. And this information currently includes the entity's name. And so when we talk about the entities, we're talking about the organization that was funded, the amount of the grant, the funding agency, so who they got money from, which agency they got money from, and the location. And, there are a number of other requirements as well. So it's a good tool for you to do your research to better understand, one, your market, who else in your area is getting funding. You can hold them accountable. You can use this information to also position yourselves to be more competitive and more likely to get a grant. All right, the federal award recipient, called the prime awardee by FFATA, files progress reports. So that's the lead agency. So they will file the progress reports via the FFATA subaward system, or the FSRS. So subrecipients, and those are the folks who are subcontractors, they are getting grants. So their relationship is with the grantee, and the grantee, or the awardee, the prime awardee, communicates directly with the federal government. So the subrecipients, those who are receiving the subgrants, they give their data to the prime awardee, and the prime awardee, as I indicated before, they communicate with the federal government. They roll up the information that they get from the subrecipient. All right, so those subrecipients with awards of $25,000 or more, they have to have their data shared by the prime awardee through the FSRS. All right, and this comes directly from Grants.gov. This is just to give you generally, a sense for how the process goes. So the sub-awardees give their reporting data to the prime awardees, and then the prime awardees, they're collecting data within their own organizations, and then they're collecting information from the sub-awardees, and then they submit all the required data via the FSRS, and then they give that to the, so once it's in the FSRS, that means it's really going to the federal agency. And then the federal grant making agency publishes the program data on usaspending.gov. I mean, and not only do they publish the program data, they're also using these same data to determine whether or not you are in compliance and looking at the progress you're making financially as well as programmatically. So it's helping them also to manage you as a grantee or as an awardee. So as you can see from this chart, and again, this chart comes directly from Grants.gov, there are three basic types of oversight. You've got the progress reports that you give them periodically. You've got site visits and technical assistance. So, from time to time, they'll do site visits, especially if you're a new organization, just to make sure things are running well. And then they'll meet with you periodically to help you fill out the forms, help you understand the terms of the contract, and even give you insights and answer questions as to how you can make your proposal or your program more impactful. And then you have the audits, right? So when we look at the progress reports, again, the grant recipients submit regular reports, and these are called the performance progress reports or research performance progress reports. And they're documenting the progress of a project through its lifespan. And for all intents and purposes, we're talking about the funding cycle. And these reports can include both expense-related data, quantitative information about the project's impact. So also, so basically you're reporting program as well as financial performance and your impact. And these data are going to be kept in a specified format so that the federal agency can then report those data to, I guess to Congress, so to speak. All right, and then they do that through this through the reporting portal that you have to put the data in. And when we look at the site visits and technical assistance, again, they will come and speak with you on site. They'll also give you technical assistance, making sure that your systems are in place so that you can properly manage your grant and properly report. And you can also keep in contact by telephone, as well as email, and get your answers, answers to questions that you might have. And then the single audit, those are for organizations that get the large grants. So in addition to the audit that you'll have with your CPA firm, you will have to go through a single audit with the federal agency. And that's to make sure that you're in compliance. And, and the reason why they do this too is they want to mitigate or reduce their risk of losing funds. So they want to make sure that everything is in compliance. The larger the grant, the larger the risk of losing taxpayer money. All right, so here are some typical reporting forms, and this comes from grant.gov as well as FSRS.gov, Office of Management and Budget. So, as you can see, these forms request a lot of different information. There's a form for asking for either an advance. If you find that your organization um, doesn't have enough money to actually um, pay up front and then be reimbursed, you can request an advance. Or you can do reimbursement, meaning you're spending the funds and then you're submitting a voucher to be reimbursed. There's an outlay report and request for reimbursement for construction programs. So everybody doesn't have to do that. You only have to do that if you're in construction. There's the financial report. There's the attachment to the financial report. There's a report of tangible personal property, any property that you might buy with federal funds. There's real property status report. There's a research performance progress report, disclosure of any lobbying activities, and then there's a data collection form if you qualify for a single audit. And again, there's technical assistance available from the grant making agency. If you find yourself filling out these forms and you have questions, you can also go to Grants.gov. They have a number of videos and other articles and other technical assistance. And they also have links to different conferences and webinars that you can attend. So everything that you need to get through this monitoring process is at your fingertips through Grants.gov. So here is a quick and dirty diagram with the budget cycle. So on the front end, you have the planning. So this planning is done by the agency. They make an announcement. And when I say announcement, there's a funding announcement. And then they look at the applications that they get in. So at that point, they're going to screen the applications and then make sure that they meet criteria. All right. So they're going to be independent criteria that are set. They'll look at the business management side, and then they'll look at the cost analysis, and then they will negotiate with your organization before making the final award. And then after they make the award, there's monitoring. So there'll be formal actions. There's going to be an audit resolution and conflict resolution in the event that problems should arise. And then there is the formal closeout. And if you're a member of the nonprofit Utopia community, you will have access to sample documents that some of our federal agencies use to prepare for site visits, that they use to examine your documentation and make sure that you're on the right track. All right, so one of the things that they're going to look at when they make the award, every grantee or awardee has to undergo a risk assessment. All right, so and I think that's even more important now in these times of change with COVID-19. So because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and neither do you, we don't know, the federal government doesn't know, they want to make sure that they can minimize their risk. Risk meaning that they could lose money because for whatever reason, you're not able to perform what you said that you could do, right? So their return on investment may not be financial so much as it is in terms of making an impact that will change communities and change people for the better. And they want to minimize the risk that you're not able to do that, right? So there will be a risk management plan put in place, and that's going to be based on the organization's risk profile. And that's going to identify and limit potential programmatic and financial losses and problems, and to provide specific strategies for reducing risk. And this could include things like training and technical assistance, changes to financial procedures. So, if they spot something lacking in your financial controls, they'll make recommendations for changes to those procedures and give you technical assistance. They'll also do the same for your management systems. They will also have expanded supervision and oversight of subgrantees. So not only are they trying to mitigate risk for you, their direct awardee, but they realize too, if your subrecipient or your subgrantees or your subcontractors, if they can't fulfill their deliverables to you, then that um, provides a risk to them. So they will also work with you and the subgrantees. So they will also include a definition of risks to be reduced, activities and initiatives to address those specific risks that they think are, higher than normal. And then they will have a process for measurement, and an implementation deadline. And this is something that you're working through in partnership. Obviously they have the leverage and the power, but it's not like they're just going to dictate to you orders from on high and then you go and do it, and you don't have an open line of communication. They're very, very open to any questions that you might have, any technical assistance you might need. If they can't provide it directly, they will definitely be able to make recommendations as to how you can proceed. And if you've not gone through this process before, and when I say this process, if you've not gotten federal grants before, you might consider, assuming that your organization is going to be in the high risk category, right? Or you might also do an assessment. We do have some tools that you can use to assess yourself, and look at whether or not you could be a moderate risk or low risk. But I would just assume if you have not gotten the funding before, that you be cautious, right? And treat yourself as if you're high risk, and that will make you and your staff more attentive to make sure that you have all the systems in place that you'll need. Okay, so what actually constitutes high risk? High risk grantees characteristics include things like a history of poor programmatic performance. The organization failed to meet performance objectives for more than 1 year. So this is for those multi-year grants. So if you're in a position where, for whatever reason, you're not able to fulfill uh, the obligations, you have to keep an open line of communication. And just because you're high risk doesn't mean that you can never, ever get a grant. It just means that they're going to provide more technical assistance. They're going to monitor you more closely, and it's for the agency's own good. Another thing that could constitute high risk is financial instability. That is, an organization has had difficulty meeting financial obligations for 2 quarters or more. And so we're talking about 6 months. So that means that you're having some cash flow issue. And that's not uncommon for most nonprofits, especially in the age of COVID. If you have a grant that's large relative to your budget, for example, your grant is 50% or more of your operating budget, that's high risk. That means you're putting a significant priority on one program, right? And you're not quite as diversified as they would like you to be. And another risk factor is large increase in a grant amount or sub-grant amount, and your grant award or sub-grant award increases by more than 50% from the prior year. So how do you manage the risk? So here's some questions for reflection. Do you understand what constitutes financial and program risk? All right, and this is for your particular grant. So every grant is going to be different, and the factors that are going to impact your grant would relate to the environment, your funding environment as well as the external environment, as well as the political environment, the specific type of program that you might have. Can you characterize your program according to risk assessment principles? So here are some of the federal requirements, and by accepting federal grants, organizations are basically agreeing to comply with grant provisions and all applicable federal statutes, regulations, and guidelines. The program has to be operated within the parameters set by the approved grant proposal and budget and other supporting documents. And then the program is governed by grant-specific requirements, relevant federal regulations, and the applicable Office of Management and Budget circulars. So those are various rules and policies that you have to follow. And your notice of grant award will reference the applicable version of all of these provisions. So questions for reflection. Do you understand all federal requirements that pertain to your grant or the grant that you're pursuing? So when you apply for grants, they'll indicate, what circulars you're going to need to comply with. And if not, do you know where to get the information that you need? Federal requirements. The grant provisions are going to specify a number of things, and that could include the applicable statutory and administrative provisions. So when we talk about statutory provisions, we're talking about the legal provisions, right? The federal statute. They will also specify responsibility for administering the grant, financial management provisions, the administrative costs, the allowable costs. They'll talk about document retention. And when we talk about document retention, that means how long you have to keep documents related to this program and related to this particular grant. If there are any matching requirements and any program specifications, and again, that's going to vary from grant to grant, from agency to agency. And then when we look at implementation, we're looking at, how do you translate what you put on paper as a proposal into an actual program, into actual action, right? So a program plan, sometimes we call it an implementation plan, a work plan, a timeline, and that gives you information about the goals, the objectives, the activities, the different tasks, who has to do what by when, what do you expect to achieve, how you're going to measure it. And all of that's important because you want to be able to evaluate how well you're doing. And it's important too for the federal agency because they are under the gun to report to their individual cabinet secretaries as well as to Congress. They have to be accountable for the grants that they make and to make sure that the programs that they're allocating money to are actually effective. So your program plan should be consistent with the program logic model that, whether or not you submitted it to the government or not, it needs to be consistent with the program logic model as well as the program narrative from the grant application. It starts with the mission statement that outlines the program's purpose and is consistent with the organization's mission. And it should include a timeline, again, and assign roles and responsibilities for achieving those key milestones. It should be prepared with input from the people who are actually doing the work, right? Or have some skin in the game. So it needs to be done with input from key stakeholders. That could be people who are actually running the program. So that could be your program team. You should have your program team report in general terms to your board. And you should also have some indication from your clients or the end users as to uh, what they need to before you finalize the program. This work plan is also going to identify the skills and tools that you need in order to achieve the program's goals and objectives. So in this case, if you have a program logic model, you're going to be looking at the resources side or the inputs side of the program logic model. And then you also need to focus on the outcomes, because all of this work is for naught if you're not actually making a difference in the lives of the people that you're serving. This plan will identify the methods for data collection and how you're going to track the progress toward your program goals and your desired outcomes. So some of the questions for reflection for yourself. Do you have a program plan that will help you implement your grant proposal? And again, whether or not your proposal is funded, this is something you really should have. What systems do you have in place in order to track and evaluate program outcomes? Are your tracking and evaluation systems consistent with the outcomes and measurements you listed in your proposal? And then in some cases, you might make subgrants. So these are people, again, you have the direct contract with the federal government, but then there may be people, agencies that are subcontracting with you to implement a certain part of the program. So a subgrant is an award of money or property made by a grantee to an eligible recipient, and the recipient in this case is called a subgrantee. Your organization is the grantee. The federal government is the grantor. Subgrantees have to follow the same rules that the lead agency does, right? They're going to have to provide the same type of documentation, but you as the grantee or the lead agency, it's the onus is on you to make sure that the subgrantees are in compliance. So you're going to be the fiscal agent, which means legally your agency is responsible for everything that happens. Okay, so it's in your best interest to make sure that your subgrantees understand what's required and actually follow through with the deliverables. All right. So subawards should be made on a competitive basis. That means ideally you have a set of criteria that you have developed to select your subgrantee to carry out certain parts of your program. You have an RFP. You have a system of assessing how well they did. And if you didn't issue it competitively, you have to be able to indicate why you didn't do that. And grant announcements with application guidelines and selection criteria should be disseminated through a broad network to maximize the pool. Again, there may be some instances where you may not necessarily have access to a wide pool and you don't have any choice but to go along with a certain subgrantee. And where applicable, the subgrant selection process should involve a peer review or community-based advisory council. So just like the federal government is using a peer review process to determine whether or not you should get your grant, they're asking you, once you get the funds, to model the same process that they use, which is to use a group of peers to help you to decide on these subawards. And this could be through peer review or a community-based advisory council. Subawards should be made on a competitive basis to make sure that they're evaluated fairly all the applicants are evaluated fairly. So that means you have to have a rigorous set of criteria or objective set of criteria and scoring system. And people need to be trained as to how to use it so that you minimize any chances of favoritism, right? So you want to treat everybody fairly, and you also want to make sure that you're getting the highest quality of applicant. The grant announcements with application guidelines and selection criteria should be disseminated through a broad network to maximize the pool of applicants and make sure that everybody is on equal footing in terms of knowing what's expected, knowing what you're looking for, right? And where applicable, the sub-grant selection process should involve peer review or community-based advisory council. And obviously, in some cases, you may be so under the gun that you may not necessarily have time to include all of those steps, or if you include those steps, you might not um, have as much time to do as deep a dive as you would like. But nevertheless, the onus is on you to cast as wide a net as possible and to have an objective criteria um, to evaluate. All right. So the monitoring system should take into account the relative risk of the subgrantee. So just as you're evaluating your own risk, and the federal government is evaluating your risk, you're going to evaluate the risk of your subgrantees. And grantees, you're the grantee, the lead agency. The lead agencies are responsible for communicating compliance and reporting requirements to the subgrantees. And then the lead agency should also provide training to the subgrantees to increase their capacity to implement the programs. So it's in your best interest to make sure that anybody that you're making a subaward to really understands the process so that they can do what they need to do and give you the information that you need to give to the federal agency. And again, this is going to take into account any training needs that you identify based on informal assessment or your own capacity assessment. All right. So, questions for reflection. Have you developed a system for selecting subgrantees that's fair and objective? What criteria will you use to select subgrantees? What systems do you have in place to manage subgrantees' programmatic as well as their financial performance? So when we look at the programmatic performance, we're looking at things like, are they making an impact? Are they reaching their goals, objectives, and their outcomes? Financial performance, how are they managing the money? Are they spending the money in a timely basis? Are they spending money appropriately? Organizations receiving federal funds should have a strong financial management system in place. They need to be following GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles. And these principles should be for nonprofit agencies. Nonprofits, as you may or may not know, have different accounting than, say, cost accounting for a manufacturer. Does your system have internal controls to it? And when we talk about internal controls, we're talking about checks and balances to make sure that no one person has control of the entire financial process. And are those systems of control evaluated on an annual basis? And are they documented? Are those changes, being made and documented? Is there a system of cost management? And that system should include things like fiscal as well as programmatic components, cost allocation, and monitoring. Are you managing costs appropriately? So are you using the budget provided in the approve proposal to actually use it as a management tool? You know, are you comparing what you said you would spend to what you're actually spending? Have you identified all the costs associated with the grant? Are you managing and documenting those costs over the life of the project? And you need to include direct and indirect costs. So those fixed costs and those variable costs. Your fixed costs or indirect costs, those are going to be things like, those are your overhead. Your direct costs are your program expenses, and those are going to vary based on how many people you serve. You need to understand the cost principles pertaining to match, allowable costs, direct costs, and indirect costs. And this is a conversation that you should have with your financial staff. You should develop a plan for sustainability. I mean, what's going to happen after this particular grant closes out? So this should include things like raising funds from other sources. It could include strategic planning. It could include creating a business that will actually throw off cash to the nonprofit. You should develop effective systems for competitive bidding of contracts and procurement, right? This will ensure, one, that you are in legal compliance, but two, it'll help make sure that you are being objective and hopefully equitable in your process. So where applicable, grantees should also have an audit done by a CPA. So this is different from the single audit. In some cases, if you get a large enough grant, say 500,000 or more, you're going to have an audit from the CPA as well as an audit from that agency. So here's some questions for reflection. Do you have a working knowledge of financial management principles? If not, make sure that you get that technical assistance and professional development for yourself as well as the people who need to have it in your agency. And just because people are program people and not necessarily financial people doesn't mean that they shouldn't understand the financial management principles. Yeah, they're not going to be the accountants keeping the books, but having a working knowledge of financial management principles helps everyone to be better grant writers and be better grant managers, and it'll open up the lines of communication between your program people, your fundraising people, and the financial staff. If you don't have this knowledge, do you know where to get it? Does your organization have a comprehensive system for organizing financial statements? And what systems do you have in place for documenting and managing costs? And does your organization have policies and procedures and financial controls in place? And a management system is basically a management structure or system where the processes work together to achieve a common goal or set of objectives. So differing from the financial system, this is really looking at the flow of activities in your organization, either for administrative purposes or to make sure that a program is running smoothly. So management systems provide an effective means of organizing and delivering programs and services, as well as administering grant funds. And again, all of this stuff should be in place regardless of whether or not you get federal funds, right? Effective organizations are structured in such a way as to achieve these objectives in a manner that's both efficient and impactful to their clients and or the surrounding community. So you're not just putting these systems in place just to create bureaucracy. You're putting these systems in place for accountability, but also to help you identify ways that you can do your job more effectively, and your organization can actually serve more people. The system should have a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, and those roles and responsibilities should be documented and it should be communicated to the board and staff. Management systems are commonly depicted in organization charts and workflow diagrams. Remember, I was telling you yesterday or 2 days ago, when you do your proposals, you should really diagram, how the work is going to be done. That not only strengthens your proposal, but it helps you to create efficient ways of working. It helps you eliminate any duplication of processes and services. Characteristics of effective management systems include written policies and procedures, and those policies and procedures should always be approved by your board of directors, and they should always be updated. All right. So, and they should be certified by your secretary with the date as well. There should be regular communications across departmental or functional lines to make sure that everybody's on the same page with respect to mission, goals, values, news, and events. And the use of technology for production, communication, and archiving information. And there should be a comprehensive human resources plan that reduces the possibility of increase in programmatic risk or financial risk when there's staff turnover. Effective human resources plans should include approaches for training new staff in their program and administrative responsibilities. It should include employee compensation, workplace safety, policies for equal opportunity, and I would go so far too as talk about policies for diversity, equity, and inclusion, ongoing staff development, and make sure too that there's significant money for that. All too often staff development is an afterthought and not a forethought. And then think about how you're going to use technology, informal and formal employee evaluation, and management training in order to improve skills of employees and ultimately make a greater impact to your clients. So when we look at these questions for reflection, one, does your organization structure lend itself to the efficient management of the program for which you seek funding? Is your program structured in a manner that will reduce the outcomes that will not reduce, produce the outcomes outlined in the grant proposal? And are there mechanisms in place for accountability? So some mechanisms for accountability obviously would be reports that will indicate whether or not you have met your goals and objectives. You will have data collection at regular intervals. You'll have assignments as to who does what and by when and that kind of thing. And it goes without saying that you need to maintain accurate records in general, but especially for the duration of this grant funded project. And then you even need to keep records of this project even after you close out. So the records help you adhere to all the grant requirements. It facilitates grant continuity. Keeping records provides leverage for future funding. So if a foundation or somebody who wants to give to you sees that you've been faithful over the federal funds and you're in good standing and been managing them pretty well, then that makes them feel comfortable giving money to your organization. And it also keeps you organized. And remember, the federal government is not trying to punish you by making sure that all of this stuff is in place. They're really trying to make sure that they're creating a win-win situation. You win because you have a more effective organization that is able to document your progress for future funding, and you're also able to make a bigger impact. But the government agencies win because they're better able to collect the data from you and get the outcomes, the desired outcomes that they have, and then report those to their higher ups. So some of the important documents you need to keep on hand are your original grant proposal, your notice of grant award, grant amendments, any documentation from sub-grantees, and that includes any contracts you have with them, any MOUs, your program budget, grant expenditures, invoices, and hard receipts, any correspondence, any contracts, any financial reports, program reports, any audits. And remember, documents should be kept 3 years from the date of the final status report. And if there's an audit, you need to keep your records 3 years after that audit. Questions for reflection. Does our organization fully understand what's required in terms of documentation? Can we produce the required reports accurately and on a timely basis? Does our organization have a document retention policy in place? So that is there an actual policy that outlines what documents, what records the organization is going to keep, where they're stored, how they're stored, what happens in the event of a crisis and you can't use your office? You know, how long do you keep those documents in place? So do you have that policy? Does your organization routinely track expenditures and keep supporting documentation on file? And you need to actually, look at yourselves, because the federal government is going to be looking at you too. So they're going to be looking at your organizations, assessing your strengths and weaknesses, and it's in your best interest to assess your strengths and weaknesses as you go along, right? So you're going to be subject to internal as well as external reviews. So internal reviews from, say, your board, right? External reviews from your auditor, from the federal agency, and and that includes audits. All right. Again, if you're getting over $500,000 in federal funds, in addition to the audit from your CPA, you're going to be subject to a single audit. And the single audit is an audit of the entire organization. So it's not just that grant, right? It's the entire organization, and it includes an examination of your finances, as well as whether or not you're in compliance with the various parts of the contract, as well as other compliance issues that are routinely done with the federal government. And this is going to determine the extent to which your organization is meeting the terms and conditions in your contract to get those federal funds. In some cases, the auditor will discover issues related to financial management or compliance, and he'll write those up as findings, right? And then the findings should be addressed by the organization with plans to prevent the issues from happening in the future. So what corrective action are you going to take? And when we look at how you address the weaknesses, even though not every organization is subject to an audit per se, they will still be subject to review, because remember, this agency has to report on your agency as well as other agencies that they gave money to. They have to give an accounting and be accountable for how those funds were used. So they may or may not audit you, and the audit could include the entire organization or the department, or even, check this out, partner organizations. So if you have partner organizations that are part of this grant and they're receiving funds, they can be subject to an audit as well. Any findings should be addressed. And when I say findings, those are areas where you're not in complete compliance with the government contracts or the government reporting. Grantees should undergo continuous assessment and improvements. And I know this sounds really scary, but you have to remember that the folks at the federal level, they're not doing the audit so that they can hang you. They're doing the audit to maintain accountability. And in the process, your own agency's capacity will be increased. So, questions for reflection. What program or financial management issues does your organization have that could be viewed as a potential weakness or risk? How are you going to address them and make sure that they don't continue? And then make sure that you document that and have a plan for it. And how is this information used to design future programs? So, some of the common compliance issues, and when we talk about compliance, we're just talking about making sure that you adhere to the rules, the policies, the contracts, and those kinds of things, right? So most federal grantees provide high quality programs. Areas that could sometimes be challenging include record keeping, meeting the match requirements and then documenting them, managing and recording time and attendance. And when we talk about time and attendance, that's payroll, making sure you're documenting your employees' time and attendance, making sure that subgrantee expenditures are allowable under the terms of the grant. So making sure that the expenditures you're paying for are in alignment with what you said that you were going to be paying for, not only for yourself, but for the subgrantees. And the subgrantees are subject to the same rules that you as the grantee are subject to. Providing sufficient subgrantee oversight. So again, you are legally, and when I say you, I'm talking about your organization is legally responsible for the, the funds as well as for the production and the performance of your subgrantees. So it's in your best interest to train them properly on all the record keeping and reporting that they need. They need to be trained properly and held accountable by you for what they said that they would do. Why? Because you're going to be held accountable for what they do. Um, Another issue is developing and monitoring budgets as they relate to actual expenditures and program goals. So basically, looking at how much you said you were going to spend on what you said you were going to spend it on. So looking at budget versus actual costs. So here's an example from the Texas Education Agency. As you know, education agencies from our state get federal funds, and these are samples of what they look at when they look at whether or not their school districts are in compliance. So types of non-compliance can include, but not limited to, things like expenditure of funds or conducting activities that are not in accordance with the grant authorizing statute. That means, there's some legislation, right, that actually authorizes the spending or the program, right? So if you're involved in activities that are not within the scope of that legislation, then that's a red flag. If you're spending money that's outside the regulations, guidelines, or approved application. Another cause for red flag is failure to account for funds in accordance with financial management standards or with the Financial Accountability Resource Guide or with the state's Financial Accountability System Resource Guide. Or, there could be findings in the federal agency's single audit or single audit performed by an independent auditor. Failure to comply with one or more provisions and assurances in the grant application. Failure to comply with programmatic or fiscal reporting requirements, or failure to comply with previous required corrective action. So if you were written up before, you prepared a corrective action plan and said, oh, this will never happen again. And you find yourself in a situation where whatever you said will never happen again is still happening. That's a problem. If you're not in compliance with refund requests or other special conditions. So you have to really make sure that whatever agreements you make with your federal agency, you're actually living up to your end of the bargain. All right. So a corrective action plan, basically, you'll get a notice from the federal agency and they'll describe the areas of noncompliance, the required corrective action, and this could include any enforcement action. So basically they're saying what will happen. You know, we've identified these things. This is how it can be corrected. And if you don't correct it, here are the consequences. And some of those consequences could um, end up, it could lead to delayed payment or even, not getting funding again, or it could even cause you to be on a list, a blacklist, so to speak, of agencies not to get funding because they weren't in compliance. All right. And your plan should have the required completion date. The agency is required to respond with a letter outlining that it has or will take the recommended actions. They're going to give the dates that they'll have it done by or the dates that it was completed, and they'll provide proof that it was in fact done. All right. So if you have any questions about compliance or monitoring your grants, let me know, post them in the chat, and I will respond shortly. I just want to let you know about a few nonprofit utopia programs that are coming up. In about 2 weeks, we'll have available a master class to show you how to start a nonprofit organization in 90 days. We're going to show you how to get it done right the first time without an attorney. And this course is going to include video instruction, checklists that you need to stay on track, worksheets so that you can flesh out your ideas for your program, for your organization. You'll have a chance to chat with me. You'll have downloadable forms and applications that you can fill out and submit to the state. I'll proofread those forms, and there'll also be instructions. All right. So for Nonprofit Utopia members, that's $125. If you're not a member, that's $175. And if you have any questions, you can email me at ValerieFLeonard@nonprofitutopia.com. And for those of you who want to take a deeper dive, you want coaching through the process, after you take the course, I can also work with you one-on-one, and we can make sure that we are submitting your documents all in a timely fashion. All right, so that's a 90-day program, and at the end of the 90 days, you'll have everything that you need. You will have filed all of your paperwork, and I will have reviewed all of it before it goes out, and that paperwork is for the state as well as for the federal government. And then coming up September 10th, we're going to be doing capacity building blocks. The capacity building blocks is a 6-month intensive, and we'll take you through every process that every effective nonprofit organization should go through in order to not only develop its leaders, but also to develop the organization. So you'll have a leadership plan that will be done within the context of how you plan to develop your organization. And again, if you have questions about that, you can email me at ValerieFLeonard@nonprofitutopia.com. Any questions about this live stream, you can post in the chat. If you happen to see this recording, you can email me at ValerieFLeonard@nonprofitutopia.com. If you If you're a member of the Nonprofit Utopia community and you have questions, you can set up office hours and we can talk in more detail about your specific situation. If you are a member of the Nonprofit Utopia community, I also have a toolkit for you where you'll see actual forms that actual state and federal agencies have used to do site visits and do monitoring of the grants. So you'll have firsthand insight and be able to look at your organization as a federal or state agency would look at it. All right. And then you can also post any questions or comments that you might have in the chat room. All right. So without further ado, I have come to the end. If there are any questions, please feel free to post. And I see that Theodore Daffin has at least come through. Thank you so much. Thank you, Theodore, for coming through. I miss seeing you in person. Theodore would come to our events religiously, so I miss him and thank him. Leslie, thank you. I'm sorry I posted your comment. It wasn't incomplete, but I did want to acknowledge your presence. Leslie is a member of the Nonprofit Utopia community. I thank you so much, Leslie, for providing feedback. If you want to complete your comment, feel free to do so. Thank you so much for stopping through. All right, so if there are any questions or comments before I leave, please post. If there aren't any questions or comments, I encourage you to go to YouTube and look at all of the videos from this series. Okay, Leslie, your work is so beneficial for our communities. Thank you so much, Leslie. I really love what I do, live and breathe for the work in the community. All right, so I promise you this time I am going to get off the line. I thank you again for tuning in. And again, if you want to catch up on anything that we discussed over the month, you can go to our YouTube channel and we have all of our videos on federal grants on our YouTube channel. Take care. Bye-bye.